on. Because we're going to do a quick little activity to see. Okay, so Rebecca says unceded lands of the Adena, Hopewell, Shawnee, Osage, Shawandasi, Cherokee, Chickasaw people. Yes, and I think, Rebecca, some of those communities moved in and out throughout Kentucky. So the Shawnee were more in central, but moved around. So a lot of those are the same as in the Maxwell Street statement. And then Ellie says formerly Seneca and Ojibwe. And then Terrence says Nanticoke and Assateague peoples. Oh, that's lovely to have a land recognition stone at your church's labyrinth. I assume it's at the church. And then Sue says Lenape in New Jersey. And Cindy says Santo Domingo, Dominican Republic, indigenous land of the Taino and Arawak peoples. Wow, we're getting people from all over. Okay, this is great. Well, I think a lot of you may have already utilized this resource, but I was hoping to have us look at the Native Lands map, which I just entered into the chat. It's a link, so you should be able to follow it. It'll take you to a site that acknowledges that it's really difficult to actually create boundaries around places that were not, and regions that were not bounded by Indigenous peoples, but they are trying to map where Indigenous peoples originally were on this map. And certainly, for example, in Kentucky, the Adena and Hopewell people were earlier on, so their territory overlaps with a lot of others. And so and you can put in specific addresses if you want. And so I was curious if we all put in our church addresses, if we saw something new or different than what we've been told before, perhaps. Oh, interesting. So Ellie's also gotten Choctaw, Adowa, Lakota, and Dene. I think I forgot to mention the Yuchi, but don't worry, they are included in the land acknowledgement. Cool. Okay, so I'm gonna first give you a little bit of our church's experience with land acknowledgements. I see a couple of us have found new things. It's great. How many of us, just by raising your hand or doing a thumbs up or something, have put together an Indigenous land statement or land acknowledgement or something of that nature? Okay, Terrence and Rebecca, cool. I'd be curious to talk to you after I kind of go through our timeline to see what similarities there are, how you guys developed that. For us, it was kind of a do something, mess up a little, edit a little, try again situation. So in 2021, we started reading a land acknowledgement from the UK College of Pharmacy. Now, the UK College of Pharmacy, I think, must have had someone on their board write this. And since Maxwell Street Presbyterian Church is right next to the University of Kentucky, is the same peoples on the land and everything, but the relationships are not necessarily the same. And so we started reading this in worship, and it was kind of like an ad hoc decision by the pastor and another person in the church. And so they just like searched and found something, and we're like, okay, this is good enough for right now, and then we can decide if we need to change anything later. And something we noticed that I had misgivings about was that the statement made it sound like Indigenous people didn't currently live in Lexington or were completely gone from that place. And I think this is a common problem with a lot of settler created Indigenous people's statements, because and it has like a lot of issues related to, or what am I trying to say? Like there's effects, because a lot of tribes who, you know, may or may not want to be federally recognized, but it's easier to get resources when you're federally recognized. And one of the things you have to do is prove that you have continually remained on your land and continually continue to environmentally steward your land and been present. And so not only is the act of saying no one, or like making it sound like no one in Lexington is Indigenous, completely false, but it actually hurts Indigenous communities who are Indigenous people who live in Lexington. And also the language was very neutral. Now, I'm sure the pharmacists were trying their best, as we all are, but it really passed the buck on acknowledging the violence of settler colonialism, and did not suggest in any way that we, the University of Kentucky, were complicit in any way. And it did not make connections related to the institution, and thus it did not make any connections about how the Presbyterian Church was complicit in settler colonialism and Indigenous boarding schools and everything like that. So the next year, I had just taken a class in grad school at UK. I was in the geography program, but I had just taken an anthropology class where we read a really good blog post on Beyond Territorial Acknowledgements, where the author, who's a First Nations person in Canada, started talking a lot about really it's more than the land that institutions and churches and settler businesses need to acknowledge. It's also that we have connections historically and currently that need to find some sort of, we need to find one, like how we are connected to people, but two, then try to figure out what a good process could be for even starting to speak of trying to repair any harm, even if a lot of the injustice occurred like 50, 100 years ago. And so thinking about that led me to think, okay, so maybe we don't actually need a land acknowledgement as in what people normally think of a land acknowledgement for our church, but we need to actually address like the larger Presbyterian denomination's complicity, as well as our own church and like the different communities that we are within that have relationships to Indigenous people. And so in 2022, we created this much longer version, which Eileen has very helpfully put in the chat. And I don't know, I think a couple of people joined more recently, so maybe I'll just like recopy and re-put it in the chat here in case someone joined afterwards. And so you can follow along, or I will be sharing my screen just so you can see kind of my thought process as we went through and edited and added. And I just want to also acknowledge, like, this did not all come from me. We used some of what the UK College of Pharmacy had written, but also we used a lot of helpful information from the Kentuckians for the Commonwealth statement, which is a local social justice organization in Lexington and other parts of Kentucky. I think they have like 5 separate offices. And since there was one in Lexington, they had pretty more up-to-date information. And I even found some articles that I hadn't read from them. And so that's like an option if you're looking for resources. In addition, I used information from Presbyterian Outlook, because there was several articles that year about pushing the Presbyterian Historical Society to investigate deeper the abuse that occurred at Indigenous boarding schools run by the Presbyterian Church. And then I also used a lot of information from land grab university investigations about land grant universities, which the University of Kentucky is one. And we'll kind of get to that kind of explanation in just a minute. Okay, first, I know I've been talking a lot. Does anyone have any questions? Feel free to unmute at this time. All right, we'll go ahead and I'll share my screen. Okay. So I thought maybe a better title than trying to figure out a different word for land acknowledgement is just the question, what are our relations? Because once we know that, that's how we can start moving forward. So on the left is the Indigenous peoples map. The other thing that I wanted to say about this is that this is actually collectively created by Indigenous peoples of the Americas and also around the world. So you can, see more interesting thing about the Maori in New Zealand and Indigenous peoples across the world on this map. And then the image on the right is a screen grab from Reservation Dogs, one of my favorite recent TV shows. It streams on Hulu, and it's an Indigenous created TV show from start to finish, including some of the music they use is country music, but most of the screenplay, the actual production, producing, directing, most of them, and all the actors, except for White Steve's actor, because he's white. But it's a really interesting look, and I think based on articles I've read is a kind of closer look into what reservation life in Oklahoma looks like today. And at some point in, I guess it's episode 6 of season 2, they have a conference for the youth of the reservation, and they bring 2 Instagram influencers who are Native to present. And this it's a comedy, and this girl who we later find out does not live within her tribal community, gives such a long land acknowledgement that one person falls asleep, but also goes back and to the dinosaurs, so starts thanking the dinosaur people. And it's kind of a funny way to think about, even though we want to recognize everything, you gotta make it work for the situation that is at hand. So you don't want to have people falling asleep during worship if you're reading the Land Acknowledgement out loud. But I highly recommend Reservation Dogs. Okay, so the beginning of our Land Acknowledgement Indigenous Peoples Month statement at Maxwell Street is just explaining what it is. A lot of people, which I assume all of you know as being part of this group, a lot of people have not investigated Indigenous rights or history in this country or settler history in this country very closely. And so it's super important, I think, here to explain what a land acknowledgement is. And some people may have heard them before, but not known what they are called. And then explain, what are we discussing? How does it relate to us? And also, why are we giving this statement at this time? And at the time that our church was writing this, and I was editing this, I wasn't completely sure what was going to happen next, and I still am not. So I wrote the last sentence thinking, okay, like, we are going to continue to think and work on this issue and, plan to act, but we don't have a clear answer for what comes next yet. Okay, and so then we got to the actual beginning, what people traditionally think of as a land acknowledgement. So Indigenous peoples always have lived on the land now called Kentucky and continue to live here today. Remember, honor, and mourn the peoples who environmentally managed and cared for this land before the arrival of European settlers. Briefly living on this land were the Osage, the Wyandotte tribe, and Miami peoples. The Adena and Hopewell peoples lived here permanently. Some of their mounds remain in the Lexington area, including at UK's Adena Park. In more recent years, the Cherokee lived in southeast Kentucky, the Yuchi in southwest Kentucky, the Chickasaw in western Kentucky, and the Shawnee in central Kentucky, including what is now the city of Lexington. White settler violent attacks forced the Shawnee to leave what is now known as Kentucky in the late 1700s. The U.S. federal government forcibly removed the Shawnee from all their ancestral land through treaties and federal law by the 1830s. Today, the Shawnee tribe is headquartered on a reservation in Oklahoma, and their citizens are working to reclaim their language and culture and land. And some of this information I also got from the Shawnee tribe headquartered in Oklahoma, but it's a little confusing because there's actually multiple reservations, but the Shawnee tribe in Oklahoma is probably the most organized and most recognized by like federal government, etc. So I think what's most important here, or what we were aiming to think about, was constant residence and care of Indigenous peoples, even if they're not from the same community. There's histories of Indian communities and land are complex, just as complex as European settler history on the land. And it's important to treat Indigenous groups as complex organisms and as people with just as complex histories. And, you know, we may never understand exactly the nuances that we understand of European settler history, but kind of important to like at least explain to the congregation that things aren't as simple as, oh, this one community lived here. And then I tried to rewrite some of the information to make sure that the verbs accurately represented the violence of settlers in the settler state. In the next slide, the settler church, right? The third part of our land acknowledgement was the Presbyterian Church USA as a denomination. So this was just following I guess this was the November following 2022's GA, when the doctrine of discovery and manifest destiny were renounced by the General Assembly. And so, and there was some ongoing stuff, especially in Alaska, regarding the Presbyterian Historical Society and Presbyterian boarding schools, but there wasn't enough specific information when I got in contact with the Presbyterian Historical Society for me to really, or at least not enough specific public information. And I didn't want to make the land acknowledgement too long, because then no one would finish it. So I tried to summarize well, but also be very honest about what happened in boarding schools and in the trail cheers, you know, Andrew Jackson, etc. So I wrote, as Presbyterians, we have a complex history with Indigenous peoples of the Americas beyond the land we occupy. Though there are many Native American Presbyterians and some Presbyterians actively opposed the Trail of Tears, many Presbyterians participated in violent land theft, forced migration, military attacks against tribes, and abuse of children through Indian boarding schools. Over 28 Presbyterian Indian schools have been identified by the Presbyterian Historical Society, and researchers continue to investigate the ways the church and its members harmed Indigenous communities. The Presbyterian Church USA is working to renounce doctrines and policies that supported systemic racism, the stealing of children from communities, and renounce the doctrine of discovery and endorse settler colonialism. Sorry. At the General Assembly in 2022, the PCUSA renounced the doctrine of discovery and manifest destiny, which played a huge role in encouraging theft and violence against Indigenous communities by settlers in the name of the church and God. At Maxwell Street, we recognize the complicity of our denomination, and we are committed to rethinking our relations to the land, Indigenous people, and sorry, I can't read because of the, anyway, you get it. And so just generally, we thought historical and current contributions to genocide and settler colonialism, actions that have been taken to try to repair some for the harm done by the domination. And then it's always important to take ownership of this complicity, because it did contribute to the wealth of the church and the denomination. And then very lastly, and I'm not sure how helpful this is for other communities, but our church was specifically founded to minister to UK University of Kentucky students. And so we have a very clear line between violent land theft of Indigenous communities and the mission of the church. But I think a lot of rural churches and even some churches in the West especially will find that the mission statements were of a lot of these churches were to minister to settler communities who were taking over Indigenous land. But it may not be as clear. And so maybe you don't have as much information as us. For people who are connected to university campuses, we're also a UKirk community, as well as literally right off UK's campus. And so I thought it was super important to discuss land grab universities that were created through the Morrill Act. And but I think some questions that you might think about is, because I know this isn't necessarily relevant to everyone, is questions of who was our church established for? And then also, like, do you have Indigenous members of your church or community that need to be acknowledged or lifted up? And I think it's always good to, at some point in the acknowledgement or statement, to talk about sacredness of the relationship between Indigenous people and the land. One of my favorite texts that I read in grad school was Land is Life by Mishana Goman. And she really helped me think about how the Indigenous peoples, and of course they all have different cosmology stories, but a lot of their relations about thinking about land as literally creation and life, and also part of the creator, helped me actually think about the Holy Spirit. And so I think it's helpful if churches recognize the spirituality and sacredness of that type of relationship, because in the past, often, as we learned through Sarah Augustine's book, people are treated as if that's not a form of religious worship or spirituality that's acceptable. And then finally, now that we've gotten through the statement, these are kind of like my next things on that potentially could respond in part to this statement. So there's an enrolled member of the Osage Nation in our community, and who's a member of our church. So I'd like to sit down with her and discuss both perceptions of the church and also the statement. And, depending on what she says, I may work with her to try to edit the statement to be more inclusive of her thoughts. And additionally, we are having an environmental justice class this fall, and we're going to discuss Indigenous land rights during the land justice section. It's the new Presbyterian Women's Study by Patricia Toole. And so we'll educate more about that, and then potentially the class might use the money that they have set aside for the very end to act in some particular way about Indigenous land rights. And then I'm hoping to create a racism in the PCUSA and church class. And so perhaps next year we will be able to read some of Sarah Augustine's book. Also, because we are right on the edge of Appalachia, it's a little complicated, but Appalachian communities typically have more influence from Indigenous peoples, because there is much more intermingling between those communities. And so there's actually more Indigenous communities around us than we think. And so I'm trying to keep my ears and eyes open, to see if other things are happening in our community that we need to be aware of. Okay. Does anyone have questions? And I'm curious, for the other two have put together land acknowledgements or Indigenous Peoples Month statements. What types of resources did you guys use?
Hi. Okay, I'm originally from New Jersey, so the first thing I want to say is that there was somebody here talking about Lenni Lenape people, and I wonder if they're familiar with the fact that New Jersey actually had an Indian reservation known as Brotherton Reservation. It didn't last very long, but it had an Indian school. It's now the town of Indians Mills, New Jersey. But down here in Delaware, where I am, there were peoples that are regarded as seasonal peoples. The Nanticoke were known to bring temporary shelter when they were at the shore where we are, and to have long houses in the woods toward Pennsylvania. Those were the summer and the winter seasons. So permanent remains of them are fairly scarce, except that, as I noted in the chat, um, we have the Nanticoke Indian Museum near to us in Millsboro, and the curator there told me that there has been some interesting research showing that they may have been a mound people. They still exist, obviously, but at some point in their history, that they were a mound people indicates a deeper past, going along with you. I'm sure you're familiar with mound culture where you are, but it's all up and down the river. But so there are Nanticoke still here. In Georgetown, which is not far from me, there is an annual gathering of the tribes, powwow, if you will. The museum is highly active, but the Nanticoke people here in Delaware were subjected to what's called removal, and both varieties, both voluntary and involuntary. So those of you in the Midwest, you may very well know some Nanticoke people, because that is where a lot of Nanticoke went. There is a woman whose name I can't come up with, who is in Minnesota, and an elder who is interested in this area, who is Nanticoke. Met her only on one of these Zooms. I've never met her in person. But the things that I made little notes for myself, our dedication is on our labyrinth, and that is because evidently Nanticoke, among many tribes, there was a lot of symbolism in circles for them, so we thought that was the appropriate place to put it. It reads, dedicated to the Nanticoke and Assateague people whose love for this land precedes ours and lives on today. I told you there were seasonal cultures, removal. Yeah, that's what I've got as far as relationship now. The curator of the museum is a man named Sterling Street. He is a library of information within his own head, but also maintains a very wonderful library there. And it's not limited to Nanticoke culture. You can find out about other cultures as well.
Great, thanks for sharing, Terrence.
Thank you.
Okay, anyone else? Okay, Valerie?
Hey, thank you for sharing this, Helen. This is very, very informative, and I'm really glad your church is doing all this work. I'm just curious how that was received by many folks of the church, as this work very often involve revisiting a past that some people might not want to hear. I'm just curious, how did the process go and how did people receive that?
So, yes, and another element of this, which some of the local Kentucky people probably know, is that a lot of the people who grew up in Kentucky were always told that there weren't permanent residents on this land. And that's actually factually incorrect, but that is what was in textbooks. So I think that's why it's so important to kind of try to do some re-education around that as well. And as far as how it was received, it felt very awkward because we would read the shortened version where I kind of summarized something from each, like 4 points. We would read that and worship during Indigenous Peoples Month. And I think people came up to me and were like, that was really helpful. But also, you could kind of see that people were uncomfortable when it was being read, but no one made any, like remarks about, oh, this shouldn't be being read in worship or anything like that. And I think what was also helpful is that, of course, it had Session's approval. So Session knew that that was going to happen prior to the month of November. So that kind of helped it on its way. And I will say I read it twice. I think the pastor read it once and one other member of the Social Justice Committee read it once. And I think maybe if we had gotten 4 different faces from the Social Justice Committee to read it, that might have been more helpful, just so people could hear it in different voices. But generally, Maxwell Street is a liberal congregation, so I think people were understanding of the need to have it read, even if they weren't willing to actually confront some of the information in the statement necessarily. One of the people who had been visiting who told me that that was really good and important work, then joined us on the Social Justice Committee. So it was great in terms of that. We got more people. But yes, it also has made, I think doing the statement first without doing as much education in like a class or something like that has made it so it's been hard for me to get a new action plan going, because and one thing that I will say, the most important thing is not to promise anything that your church is not going to do, right? Like, because Indigenous people have been given false promises from white people for centuries. And so there was a bit of a bind because there was no obvious like action that would be taken afterwards. But we can still say, like, this is not just, we don't believe this anymore. And we appreciate and honor the Indigenous people who still are in our community today and who worship with us. In fact, yeah, I think if we had a less outspoken Session, then it maybe would have had more pushback. But at the time, it was kind of coming off of the Black Lives Matter movement. So there was a general sense that we needed to acknowledge things that we never knew before. And so, and it was, we needed to do that with the history of racism in our church, as well as the history with our church and Indigenous people. But I will say, I think I'm one of the main people in the church who are passionate about Indigenous rights. And since I'm the chair of the Social Justice Committee, I can kind of force us to move some in that direction. But if I was not, then it probably would have been harder.
Helen, just on a practical side of things, I believe I remember you telling me that during the month of November, the church reads the acknowledgement in full one Sunday, and then you have a shortened version for other Sundays, right?
Yeah, and especially when we first made the huge one, because yeah, it's not practical to read every single sentence every Sunday, because then people will start getting upset that they're late to the UK basketball game or something, which is apparently a huge deal here. But I'm sure other communities have the same issues where if the announcements take too long, then people are upset.
Well, I really appreciate all this information. It sounds like hard work, but really well done. I'm wondering, and I think I know the answer to this, but I'm wondering what has been the response from the students, the UK students, some who are at your congregation, but through you, Kirk, or in any other way, that the church is making this step forward.
So when we wrote this statement, I was in a collective with University of Washington students who were trying to do some education on campuses, or sorry, University of Wisconsin students, Madison, who were trying to do education and reading groups on campuses about land grab universities and state institutions that profited from the Morrill Act. And we had lackluster attendance. I think people outside of the collective were interested in reading and stuff like that, but it became really difficult to, Wisconsin was also on the central time zone. And so trying to find a time zone where everyone would be able to meet was difficult. I do know that I don't know if students at UK who come to Maxwell Street for worship actually know much of this history, because I was in a graduate program and so we were talking about it, but this is, you know, geography, which is a field where most university students don't even take a single class in geography. And but I know the campus union briefly talked a little bit about this, and also that there are movements on different campuses, especially Californian campuses, related to especially is it Mauna Kea in Hawaii, that is the observatory is on top of, that the Kanaka Maoli people want back, obviously, because it's actually their land. And different institutions are more currently involved, whereas at UK, it's a little more difficult to draw those lines between our land parcels and communities, because as we said in the statement, there's 38 communities who were stolen from for that capital. And so that makes it much more confusing, because it's not even land that was in Kentucky. It's all land that was in the Midwest somewhere. And I don't know. Basically what I'm saying is I graduated and I'm not entirely sure where the work was left. And I'm also not sure that the average student knows anything about this, because land grant universities are typically considered a way for lower middle class, lower class people to be involved in universities. And so they're seen as a way to get into the middle class. And a lot of universities really love that, but don't talk about how they were funded.
Thanks so much, Helen. Does anybody else have a comment or question before we have some announcements? Mark?
Yeah, I have a question. I'd like to know a little bit more about the Indian boarding schools.
Yeah.
And part of the reason for that is personal, in that I grew up in Lawrence, Kansas, and we had one on the edge of town, the Haskell boarding school, and it was there, 60 years ago. And I'm wondering if it's, if it's still there. But I never knew, I just knew it was there. I never learned anything about it. And
Yeah.
I think it would be an interesting area to study. I mean, some of these boarding schools, were all these boarding schools run by different denominations or governments, or how? I don't even know the one that I knew about in Kansas. I don't know who ran it. I assumed it was a Bureau of Indian Affairs or something. And I think this is an important issue and was wondering if these places even still exist, either as an Indian school or as some other use of the space in the land.
So,
And of course, the whole issue of boarding schools raises the issue of all kinds of abuse and possible abuse and all that kind of thing. So I think that's an interesting area to explore. I wonder if you knew anything more about it.
So let me put a thing in the chat from the Presbyterian Historical Society. So there's a link to their list of Presbyterian boarding schools. There are a lot in Oklahoma, some in Kansas. I'm not sure if the one you described was Presbyterian.
Yeah.
Even the most famous boarding schools in the country are typically like Carlisle, where abuse and killing children was all over the place. That's created by a Presbyterian. So even if they were run by the US government, it was closely linked. There's a lot of history of Presbyterians and boarding schools and industrial schools in Alaska, because one of the Presbyterian settlers there was very instrumental in establishing those. So that's what I know. Now, there's a lot of work done by federally recognized tribes to try to get, I believe it's the Hope and Healing Act, or like, what is the act called that website real fast. There is a lot of organizing around.
Yeah, I know that the I'm forgetting the name myself, but I know that the Coalition to Dismantle the Doctrine of Discovery is promoting that. Let me see. Anyway, we'll share it.
Here's the one that the Shawnee are specifically trying to get reparations, and I think it's something to do with it. It is in Kansas, but it's not the one that you talked about. They're trying to get ownership over that land and then properly bury the children, as well as, I think, do some spiritual cleansing and healing stuff. Oh, Cindy put something in too. Oh, yes. Cindy's right. Yes. The Truth and Healing Commission on Indian Boarding School Policies Act. And Cindy, do you know where that is? Is that something that has even come up? Has it come up in committee, or is it something that gets proposed every session.
So I just did some creative Googling to find that. I do know that something came up with it in February of this year. So it passed the Senate, looks like it passed the Senate in June of 2023, and the House introduced it in February of 2024. So it looks like it might still be in committee at this point, but it is a good one to watch. I'd not known that that was even out there, so I appreciate you tickling
And-
that information out.
And it's not, I don't believe at this time that the Office of Public Witness in DC has an action alert on that. So that might be something we might want to encourage them to add that. I can work on that. Barry? Oh,
First,
did you want to say something, Helen? Sorry.
No, I realized Barry had his hand up and I was
Okay.
calling him.
Okay.
first, Helen, as a retired higher ed educator, I wanted to thank you for the scholarship that you brought to this. I think that was really useful, and I say that because I'll probably plagiarize particularly the portion that you wrote about the Presbyterian history. As some others on this call know, I did a presentation previously, and by way of confession, when a proposal was made to our session to do a land acknowledgement, I actually opposed that on the grounds that we should develop more of a relationship and do an action before we did an acknowledgement. But reasonable people can disagree about that. Thanks to being asked to do a presentation to this group, I'm now renewing my activities in this area, and we will be doing a class on the advocacy that we actually did on behalf of a local tribe. What I'm really hoping to move toward is two actions that we could do. One would involve committing money, and the money would be in the form of a tax payment that a local group facilitates, a group out of Oakland, that then that money is used to try to reclaim land. And then the second would be to have a permanent place on our campus for the acknowledgement, so that it wouldn't depend upon just being read on occasion. And so those are two specifics that I'm hoping to work toward. And one complication we have here, which others may run into, is that we have a land recognition issue for a group that would like to be recognized, and it's gotten caught up in some battles over gaming rights between recognized and not recognized tribes. So one has to walk sort of a fine line on that, but that wouldn't keep us from doing an acknowledgement. It's just that it's a factor you have to get in. But the final thing I wanted to say is I did put in chat along your point about the relationship between Indigenous peoples and land, an essay by one of my former faculty members at the University of South Dakota, which relates to the sacred Lakota lands that Anglos call the Black Hills, and it's got some very good discussion that Frank has done. Draws some on the work of Martha Minow at Harvard Law School and others, but I couldn't figure out how to get a URL other than the one that allows me to download it. So I just suggested that you can do a search and it'll pop up for you. But thank you.
Thank you, Barrett. And I'm so glad someone from California was here, because I was curious if any other churches were doing. I'd read some about I think the Oakland and maybe some Berkeley tribes who had started to try to suggest that people do taxes to the tribe as a form of reparation.
Yeah,
Um,
that group actually exists, and maybe I can find them real quickly.
Okay, yeah, because that is not available to a lot of us in the rest of the country. And so there, it's nice when groups have already kind of tried to figure out what would be most helpful for them, but for a lot of them, they probably never have been asked, or are leery of working with church people. So that kind of complicates relationships.
Yeah, I've got a link I'll post in chat. Now, I should say, I don't know a lot about this. It's just the group that I do know about that I intend to investigate as a possible way to pay a land tax.
So we're coming up on the hour and real fast. So Helen, thanks so much. This has been really great. Would you be able to share maybe your PowerPoint, because folks might, I think especially having the text and having kind of the process questions that would be good for people to think through when they're shaping their own or revising their own. And any resources, there were a couple of resources you named that if you can think of those, if you have links to those or anybody else, please send me an email. I want to give one quick update on Oak Flat and Apache Stronghold. They are going to be delivering their appeal to the Supreme Court on September 11th. You'll be proud to know that the Presbyterian Church's Office of Public Witness in DC will be the main base on that day, given the proximity with the Supreme Court building. So they will be, operating in and out of the United Methodist Center there in the Presbyterian Church's offices. There is a prayer journey that is going to be leading up to that day that's pretty much already started. They're kind of going, I'm going to try to drop, I'll send a, do you all see that image? It's kind of, and Helen, you'll be interested to know that Apache Stronghold is coming to Lexington on August 29th. So we should talk about this as a part of their journey to the Supreme Court. Some of you all might also see places close to where you are. I'll send out a link because they are constantly updating in real time more information on where exactly they'll be when they hit these places. Yeah, and so I'll send out an email with a lot of different resources from both this call, but also some updates that you all might want to check out. But thanks again, Helen, and thanks so much to everybody for taking the time. And this is also being recorded, so you'll be able to share it with anybody in your congregation and beyond maybe that wasn't here. So thanks and take care.